The crimes against Jean Bradley was noted as one of the most notorious unsolved cases in the UK. This case still continues to receive publicity tens of years later. This is the case of Jean Bradley. Jean Bradley was a 47-year-old businesswoman who lived on Pine Ridge in Crowthorne in Berkshire. She lived with her long-term partner Nicholas Osborne, who she'd been with for 21 years. Her partner was a teacher, and Jean had previously worked as an air stewardess for the Royal Flight. But now Jean was working with an American firm, Prioka. It was a relocation management company. The company specialised in helping other companies move premises. Jean worked at an office in New Bond Street in central London, approximately 30 miles from her home. With her new office being in central London, there was nowhere to park, and most people working in central London either live in central London or commute by train or tube, because parking is very scarce. When Jean had first received the news that she'd got the job in London, she had been excited but yet concerned on how she would commute there from her home in Crowthorne. Her and her partner had looked at maps, trains, tubes, and driven the route. In the end, they decided that the best way for her to get to work was to drive her car to Acton Tube Station and then make the rest of the journey by a fast underground tube to New Bond Street. But leaving her car near Acton Tube Station was a concern for her. Part of the process involved determining whether the road that she was going to leave her car parked on all day every day was safe, as she was interested in keeping it meticulously clean and free of damage. Her boyfriend had said that when they checked out the streets that Jean could park her car on near to the tube station, they had not formed any views on her personal safety regarding the streets, noting that it was simply in mind that they were considering whether the car would be safe. Jean's boyfriend had said that he had spoken to Jean on the Sunday night as he was in Rome on a school trip, as he was a teacher. They noted that they both had plans to go back to Rome on a holiday about a week after Easter, when he got back from the school trip, adding that Jean was very much looking forward to going. On the 25th of March 1993, Jean Bradley had set off for work, driving towards Acton Tube Station as usual. She parked her BMW car in the morning in Carberry Avenue, and in the afternoon she left work and travelled home on the Piccadilly Underground tube line from Green Park Station, arriving back at Acton Tube Station at 7:20 p.m, by which time it was now dark. As she left the station and walked back to her car in Carberry Avenue, she stopped off a local shop to buy some cans of drink. Another commuter reported walking past Jean in Gunnersbury Gardens on the way back to her vehicle, but by now there were very few people in the street at this time. As Jean arrived back to her car, she unlocked it, opening the door and placing a handbag on the back seat, when suddenly a man who seemed to randomly appear from nowhere started to attack Jean. He grabbed hold of her, causing her to scream out in shock and pain. She shouted for help, hoping to attract attention from someone, a resident or a passerby, as the man drove a sharp, long object into her chest and stomach 8 times. Jean collapsed to the ground next to the car, bleeding out and slowly fading, shocked, in pain, and alone. A carpenter driving his van down the street, he saw the struggle, and the carpenter stopped his van. He jumped out to confront the attacker, who started to run from the scene. The carpenter gave chase, running after him down the street, pursuing him for over a mile as he ran from the scene. Following him as the attacker ran along Carberry Avenue, a woman who also saw what was happening, said that the man was quite tall and seemed to be taking very long strides as he ran. She said that he looked really odd. He was wearing a very silly hat and certainly was not the type of hat somebody would wear around that area. The woman quickly sent her son to call the police, as back then people did not have regular mobile phones, so her son ran to the nearest house, knocking on the door to ask to use the landline. Later, the carpenter would describe that the man had a black bag in his hand with something rigid in it. At one point, after running after the attacker for some time, the carpenter came face to face with him. The man threatened him as he pulled out a long, sharp knife from the black rubbish bag he had in his hand, saying, "You will get this as well, or I'll have you." The attacker was tall and gaunt, with drawn-in cheeks and prominent cheekbones. He was described as being a white male in his late 30s to early 40s, with a gaunt-looking face and a large nose. The carpenter who chased him said that the man appeared pale, with at least a few days' stubble, and said that he was around 6 foot to 6'3" tall, and most notably was wearing a black odd hat, which was particularly unusual as it was a dry night. Furthermore, this hat appeared to have been made from a bin liner. After the carpenter confronted the man, the two ran off into Gunnersbury Lane, just off the North Circular Road. Passers-by quickly came to Jean Bradley's aid as she lay on the ground. The police and ambulance had been called and were on the way, and while the carpenter continued to give chase, but even with the ambulance arriving on scene, and attempts were made by the paramedics to revive her. But Jean Bradley unfortunately lost her life, even before she made it to the hospital. The amount of time she had been stabbed and the large amount of blood she had lost, unfortunately, had sent Jean into hypovolemic shock and cardiac arrest. It was later determined that Jean had been stabbed 8 times with a blade that was at least 8 inches long, which was believed to have either been a butcher's knife or a carving knife. Jean even had defensive wounds on her hands where she tried to fight with the attacker and grab the knife, but the man, who was said to have been over 6 feet tall and wielding this weapon, was no match for Jean, who had not expected this to happen, who was just travelling home. After chasing the killer into Gunnersbury Lane, the carpenter continued to pursue the man as he ran towards Acton Town Station, and a woman in a vehicle who had witnessed the initial events had turned round and decided to drive past again in order to get a good view of the man. This crazed man then suddenly turned into Bollow Lane and into Bollow Bridge Road and the South Acton estate, all still while being followed by the carpenter, who would not let up. At the edge of the estate, the carpenter almost caught up with the man once again, as he appeared to be quite unfit. He did not even attempt to take a shortcut by jumping over a low railing and seemed to be waning a bit. When they passed into Church Road, where the carpenter lost the man near the Prince of Wales pub, 79 Church Road. However, a man who just happened to be looking at over his balcony, watching from the top of a block of flats, saw this man running and saw his next move. Of course, at the time, the man did not know that this was a murder, that this man had attacked Jean Bradley, but he was just looking over his balcony. He saw the man hide in the doorway of a block of flats on Ragley Close. The kid took off his hat, probably sweating from the chase, especially if this hat had been made from a rubbish bag, revealing to the man in the flats that this attacker had jet black hair. The attacker was said to have been wearing a 3/4 length cream parka coat, and the witness also reported him definitely being flat-footed. The man in the flats said that the attacker had then started looking around, trying to work his way out of the estate. The attacker was last seen walking up Buckland Walk towards Acton High Street, a mile and a half away from where Jean Bradley had been assaulted. There had been 7 sightings reported of the chase, and the murder of Jean Bradley made front-page news because of the dramatic chase by the carpenter. It seemed very similar to the unsolved murder of Penny Bell, which I've also covered on this channel. nearly 2 years earlier. However, investigators quickly concluded that the murders were not linked. Comparisons were also made in the press between the murders of Jean Bradley and Rachel Nickell. Although somebody was caught for the Rachel Nickell murder, if you watched the video before this, you'll know that Robert Napper was the one that was convicted for Rachel Nickell. Now, similarities were looked at the time, although the differences in age were quite big. Jean was an older lady of 47 years of age, and Rachel Nickell, victims of Robert Napper, were all in their 20s, and also all of the victims of Robert Napper was actually assaulted, whereas Jean Bradley was not. Although police also said that there were no links to these cases, no motive for the murder of Jean could be found, with nothing of hers being stolen. Initially, it was considered by detectives that the only possible motivation for this crime was robbery, which had gone wrong. But Jean Bradley's handbag was still left lying on the back seat of her car when she was getting into it when she was attacked. The murderer, who had been seen by many, was described as clearly a strange character who had probably come to the notice of those in the psychiatric services or those working with individuals with drink or substance problems. A reconstruction of the murder of Jean Bradley was made at 9 p.m. primetime television on Crime Watch 3 weeks later, as detectives spoke out, appealing to the public for information, asking for anyone who recognised the photo fit to come forwards with information, asking those working in such professions to come forward if they have information on the man. And it was suggested by detectives that this man could have bought his clothes from charity shops. It was also revealed that many people who had witnessed the chase had not come forward yet, and the lead detective was pleading for them to help catch this man. The killer was described as someone who did not appear to look after himself very well, and the gauntness in his face made him stand out. A piece of plastic from the black bag that the man had wrapped the knife in was recovered from the scene. It had a distinctive logo on it, the brand name Narcissus on it, with other words indecipherable. The bag was traced to a manufacturing company in Ayrshire in the UK. It was discovered that the bag was used by a health food shop nearby and a photographic company in Fleetwood, but was no longer manufactured. Over the following months, the Metropolitan Police investigated 400 possible suspects. They held identity parades, which failed to yield any concrete results. There were also appeals for a street vendor who had been knocking on doors to come forward, as he may have cited the man who had done this crime. Whilst he was only estimated to be about 20 years of age, he needed to be accounted for. Detectives believed that he may have spotted this man loitering the streets. Despite these multiple avenues of investigation, Jean's killer remained on the loose. The company Jean had worked for prior to this offered a £20,000 reward for information that led to an arrest. A mobile police station was set up on Ragley Close, nearby to where this had happened. Several people had seen the person involved but had not come forward. The lead detective said that when we find the man, we will have no difficulty with identification after so many people had seen him. Detectives said that they believed that this man must have known local knowledge of the area because of the route he had taken during the chase. It was revealed that a number of people had reported seeing a man matching the description of the killer. He had been seen acting suspiciously in Acton and on trains around West London. On the 28th of August 1993, 5 months after Jean's murder, an unemployed 39-year-old man named Francis, or Frank Marnell, of Downside Walk in Chiswick, was charged with the murder of Jean Bradley. The news of this charge was reported on an episode of Crime Watch in September. People were pleased that this man had been caught, not only for Jean and her family, but for women who felt unsafe in the area since the events of that evening. It was revealed on that episode of Crime Watch that 2 locals had originally brought police's attention to the individual. Frank Marnell had a history of mental illnesses. He had regularly had bouts of psychosis and most certainly had problems with drink and substances. He had been living in a small bed and breakfast hotel nearby at the time of the crime, and when detectives questioned him, he denied committing the crime but accepted he may have done it, and maybe he just couldn't remember. I think I'd remember. He had also voluntarily called the police that night to say that he may have been in the area at the time when Jean was killed. A strange thing to do, to draw attention to yourself. For what purpose? He told detectives that he had been waiting at Acton Town Tube Station for a girlfriend. Police set up an identity parade. Significantly, the carpenter who had chased the man through the streets that evening and gone face to face with him picked him out as Frank Marnell at the identification parade. Police felt that they had their man. He'd been living close by at the time, barely had an alibi, seemed to have mental illnesses, thought that he may have done it and not remembered, and was picked out by this carpenter. So police charged Frank, and he waited in prison for his trial date. Later, testifying in court, the carpenter talked about the identity parade. He said, "The minute I walked into that room, he caught my eye." Another witness also identified Frank Marnell as the killer during another identification parade, and a third eyewitness said that they were 98% certain that he was their man. Other suspects were able to be eliminated, and at a magistrate's court hearing on the 11th of November 1993, guess what? Frank Marnell was freed after the magistrate judge decided that the evidence against him was not strong enough to hold up in court. Other witnesses who had not got as close to the man as the carpenter had also picked this man out in an identification parade. The two friends of Frank Marnell claimed that he had an alibi. A police spokesman told the press, "This result came as a shock, and we are very disappointed and disheartened," while the lead detective on the case, Bob Fenton, said, "Nothing shocks me in the criminal justice system anymore." The Crown Prosecution Service had already known about the alibi evidence given beforehand, but had granted permission to charge him, indicating that they disregarded the claim that he had an alibi, charging him anyway. After the case collapsed, detectives said that they were going to liaise with CPS on the next steps to take. Jean Bradley's murder was highlighted again by the Independent newspaper in the year 2000 when it was revealed that the Metropolitan Police had the worst clear-up rate for murder in Britain. In 2001, it was reported that Jean Bradley's case would be one of several subject to new forensic examinations in attempts to solve the case. And in 2008, after the conviction of Robert Napper for the murder of Rachel Nickel on Wimbledon Common, it was reported that detectives would reinvestigate Robert Napper on possible links to Jean Bradley. I've already told you what my thoughts are about that. The murder of Jean Bradley was subsequently mentioned in a book by Lawrence Allison and Marie Ayres in 2009 on Robert Napper titled The Killer in the Shadows, The Monstrous Crimes of Robert Napper. On the 28th of March 2013, an episode of criminologist David Wilson's series Killer Behind Bars, The Untold Story aired that reinvestigated possible links between Robert Napper and Jean Bradley's murder. Jean Bradley's murder had been noted as one of the most notorious unsolved UK cases, and the case continues to receive publicity all these years later. Her family still have no answers, and this case remains unsolved.